I love that last reading from the gospel that Dana was reading. The point being that, the squeaky hinge gets the oil. If basically this person kept coming and coming and coming to this judge until the judge, who was somewhat unjust, gave her what she wanted, justice. And the point was, if the judge would do that, who really doesn't love this woman, how much more so will God immediately do that for us, whom he does love? The understanding of God is a hard thing, and therefore we need to continually work upon it. And that means at times that we will wrestle with God. That first reading from Genesis, Jacob is traveling, and he basically comes to a place at the fork of a river called Jabbok. And I discovered that it flows from, I think, 1,300 feet above sea level to 1,150 feet below sea level. 230-mile journey through a cavern that is pretty narrow. And when he got there, he prays, and all of a sudden he's talking to a man who they argue, and he wrestles with the man. And the man is not doing very well, and so he dislocates Jacob's hip, and Jacob still won't let him go. And so Jacob says, I won't let you go until you give me a blessing. And interestingly, the blessing is to change his name from Jacob to Israel. And the word Israel means he who wrestles with God. If you think about it, in the course of our lifetime, we do wrestle with God. I mean, when I was a boy, I went to Sunday school. I used to go to church when I was in elementary school every day. And when my father died, when I was 14, I remember thinking, how can this be? How can God, who loves us, have something this horrible happen? And that put me on a journey where I was wrestling more with God to understand those kinds of things. The first was, is there really a God? And seminary, I think I went to a Roman Catholic seminary, which was 4 years studying philosophy and 4 years studying theology. And the 4 years studying philosophy, most of the seminarians hated. They wanted to get to the second part, which is theology. But I love philosophy because it's based on what you can prove. And so one of my favorite courses that was taught was called theodicy, the study of God. And one of the things there was the proof for God's existence. And so this was something I was looking for. There were some who offered proofs that were horrible. René Descartes, for example, said, the theme that in his mind was cogito ergo sum. If I think what I think, therefore it must exist. Well, I can think of a unicorn. That doesn't mean it exists. So I didn't like that proof. I didn't think that was very effective. But the one I came upon that I really enjoyed and I worked with was draw a circle and put everything that exists inside the circle. You, me, this church, birds, dogs, cats, everything. What do we all have in common? It took me a long time to think about it, but the answer is nothing in the circle can create itself. I mean, we're created by our mothers and fathers. This building is created by artisans and so on. So if nothing in the circle can create itself, where'd the circle come from? There must be something outside the circle who creates at least one thing in the circle, and we call that something outside the circle God. Now, there was a challenge to that proof from science, namely that the theory of the conservation of energy There's always the same amount of energy. It changes shape, but it's always the same amount. Well then, but what are the formulas for energy? I'm bringing you back to school now, probably high school. Potential energy is weight times height. Picture a boulder at the top of a cliff. You know, it has weight and it has height. If I push the boulder off the cliff and it starts to fall, it has kinetic energy. 1/2 the mass times the volume squared. If you're underneath it, when it decides to hit the ground, you're squished. But you can't define that boulder. You can't define energy, I mean, without that boulder. And so the question goes back to, where did the boulder come from? Now you're back to the validity of the proof. Even modern science in the last 20 years has been proving that God exists through science. There's a famous book that I read and I liked a lot. The author being it was an atheist who was the author, Francis Collins, who was the creator of the Genome Project to figure out the DNA. He called that understanding it the language of God. But within the book, you know, he says people keep referring to the Big Bang theory as to how the world began. But okay, that explains the process, but it doesn't explain where did all the things that blew up come from. It's the exact same proof as the circle. You know, interesting that there's a Big Bang theory, but where did all the things that blew up come from? There must have been a creator. And so this atheist, through science, came to believe that there must be a divine being. But then, you know, you begin to have other things happen to you, such as my father's death. You know, such as we all have had a member of our families die. We all at times get sick. I just came back from burying my brother. The question then is, well, you know, why would God allow suffering? And again, you know, I wrestled with that for many years. And there's many answers, but I'll just give you a few. One of the answers is that suffering is a wake-up call. You know, we're so immersed in what we want to do and where we want to go and our pleasure that we don't sort of think about the meaning of life. We're into enjoying today, not paying attention to the big picture. Well, suffering sort of wakes you up to look at the big picture. It's like, you know, God knocking on the door saying, hello, you're mortal, you know, this is not going to last forever. So pay attention here. How are you doing in your growth? Growth? Yes, this life is not going to last. Why were you born? What is the purpose of your life? It's not going to last forever. You can pile up a whole bunch of money, which is great. When you die, it doesn't go with you. And even when you live, you know, have you ever seen somebody who's rich? They never seem to have enough. They always want more. It's never enough. So the purpose of life is not that. The purpose of life is to learn how to love. And the more you love one another, the more fulfilled you are as a human being. And suffering sort of makes us wake up to that point, that this is a process of growth, our life. It only lasts just so long. And therefore, how are you doing in that process? You know, if you're sitting there watching TV and playing games but not doing anything to grow spiritually, you're kind of wasting your time. So spend more time thinking about that. So suffering wakes us up and then helps us grow. Because we realize that's the purpose of being here. And then it also gives us hope. Hope? Yeah, you know, would you desire, if I could offer you perfect happiness, would you accept that? You'd say, well, yeah, of course I would. Every human being wants to be perfectly happy, but no human being is. So if all of us somehow have come to the decision that we'd like to be perfectly happy, but it's not possible, that makes God cruel. Sort of like holding a steak to a dog. Would you like the steak? And the dog wants to go for it, and you lift the steak up. That would be like torture. But God is good. God would never torture us. And so therefore, well then, if it is not possible to attain perfect happiness here, it must be able to attain perfect happiness after this life. And so people began to think that there was an afterlife, that there was a life where we would be resurrected just as was Jesus. And Paul, clearly explains that. He wants Timothy to make it clear to the people of Ephesus, because the people of Ephesus thought only your soul is resurrected. And no, Paul says, we're not ghosts. We're men and women. And we have bodies as well as souls. And so when you die, and when you go to the life after this, you go with a body, a spiritual body. That is one that never ages, never suffers, pain no more. But, if you have a very healthy body, but you have a sick soul for the rest of eternity, we call that hell. But, we want you to grow so that in the afterlife with this healthy body, you have a happy soul, a mature soul, one that knows how to grow, one that knows how to connect with other people. That's heaven. Now, all of this took years and years of my life to figure out. Does God exist? Why does God allow suffering? There are many questions that today's people don't ask because they don't seem to care. In that letter from Paul to Timothy, he mentions there will be a time when people pay no attention to sound doctrine. I kind of think that's happening now. We live in a very, very secular world. Very few people go to church anymore. They don't seem to understand. The largest group of people who are religious are called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. They don't belong to any religious organization. They're not Catholic, they're not Protestant, they're not Jewish, they're not Hindu, they're not Buddhist, they're nothing. They're none. And, people say to me, well, I believe in God, but I don't have to go to church. Well, I believe in education, but I think I have to go to school if I have a child. If you're going to grow, what a better place to learn than here and with one another. Not just about God, but about the morals of life and how to live with one another. So this is the process by which you and I wrestle with God throughout our lifetime. Not quite fully understanding, but wanting to understand more and more and more to increase our sense of maturity and our sense of happiness. So, interestingly, in the place where Jacob learned the same message was called Penuel. He called it Penuel, which means looking at the face of God. I think that, when you actually spend time thinking about what matters in life, reading the Bible, reading books that help you understand the Bible, it's like, for me, it's like candy. When I'm preparing a sermon, I love preparing a sermon. I spend hours and hours doing it, researching readings and so forth. It's like I've learned a little bit more, a little bit extra about God that I didn't know before. And even though the readings may repeat, I still research them new every time to get a sense of newness in my own life. So I'm saying to you, if you think you're not a good Christian because you're wrestling with God, no, you're not. I mean, you are a good Christian. St. Anselm, who was the mentor of St. Thomas Aquinas, said to him, it's okay to doubt, but it's not okay not to resolve the doubt. It's okay to doubt, but not to work to resolve it is being lazy. Don't be lazy. that child back there is not lazy at all. He's working very hard. Anyway, don't be lazy, work on your faith, and you'll be happier and happier.
Amen.